All right, Noel, episode 39 in 5, 4, 3, 2.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Noel Casler podcast, episode 39. I'm back here with my main man, Jimmy Kennedy, LLJK. Ladies love Jimmy Kennedy to break down the week's events. We hope you all had a happy Thanksgiving. We're recording this on the holiday weekend. Jimmy, how was your Thanksgiving, man?
It was great, man. Small gathering. I hadn't seen my family for that gathering in a year, obviously with the pandemic. But I come from a big Irish family, so we've lost a lot of people over the years. So it's always sort of an emotional holiday with the people we've already lost, but with the tone of the world on top of it. We were certainly thankful, and as much as I complain about this country and how it could be better for folks. In my personal situation, it could be far worse. So I have to count my blessings.
Yeah, man, there's always something to be grateful for, and if you're living in gratitude, like for me, that's as close as I could be to any kind of spiritual sort of higher power, because when you have gratitude, you realize you already have enough, right? It's easy to think about what you don't have, but there's always somebody with less, and be grateful for what we have if we have it, because it's all fleeting. And I was down in Philly for a lot of the week, and then I drove back on Thanksgiving. But there's so many homeless people down there and in the cities in New York City and all the major cities. It's such a crisis. That's something that's dogged this country as long as I've been aware of it. It sort of started in the early 80s under Reagan. Obviously, he sort of cut all that social services and deregulated the mental health institutions. And they basically threw a bunch of people on the streets. And now with income inequality and addiction and all these issues, it's very jarring being in a metropolitan area. And I hadn't been in Philly in a long time. And Philly, of course, is a beautiful city. It's just a gorgeous colonial city. I mean, colonial is a bad word, but that federalist architecture. I'm not talking about the process of colonialism. I mean, just, it's like Ben Franklin's house and stuff, and this whole square, and unfortunately their other big square is called Rittenhouse Square. So it was hard to, Rittenhouse was one of the founding sort of families of Philadelphia. So everywhere you go, you see like Rittenhouse Lounge at Penn stuff,
Yeah.
But it was good to be down there. Back to the homelessness. It's like, human suffering weighs heavily on me, as it does to most people, that are semi-conscious, and so does like any sentient being, animal suffering. So something like Thanksgiving is always a double-edged sword for me, because there's so many people going without. And, there's so many people not doing anything to help that situation. They're just trying to score some points with their team. And we'll get into that in a minute, because obviously that stuff is still going down. But ultimately, it was a really nice holiday. It was nice to get out of town. I went to the Constitution Museum, which is a new museum. I think in the last 10 years or so, they've opened it. And there's a thing in that document that gets overlooked. I talked about this in the card rant. And, one of the promises that the founding fathers had, at least for themselves, right, wealthy white men, was domestic tranquility. This concept of like, if you're living at home, we're going to be at peace. You're not going to have warring tribes and people worried about the next village coming over to your village to attack you in the middle of the night and steal all your chickens and stuff, as it had been, for so long in so many places, and I think that's overlooked. I think in the mess and the dumpster fire that Trump set off in this country, that's one of the things he robbed from us is the concept of domestic tranquility, because we don't have that anymore. And I know that's a theme on this podcast, how people are so rude to each other in traffic and revving up their engines, and people have these Mustangs supercharged, so it sounds like a blitzkrieg when they're taking off at a traffic light, and that may sound cool to you as a 25-year-old thinking you're going to pick up a chick in the bowling alley parking lot because you have a loud engine in your crappy American car, right? It might impress a certain demographic, but if you're an old lady sitting in that car, and you hear that sound, or it's coming up next to you on the highway. It's happened to us on the highway where we jump because somebody revs their car to go past you, and they're clearly doing it in this aggressive manner. And what I'm talking about is this hostility that Americans now have for each other. You know, we've lost something. We've lost one of the constitutional, promises. And it's ironic that it's happening at the hands of this party that claims the Constitution as this holy document, right? It's the mantle they live under. The Second Amendment, the Second Amendment, Patrick Henry was talking about well-armed, well-regulated militias to protect themselves against revolts from enslaved people. Don't kid yourself, right? It wasn't like, oh, we need to protect ourselves because we live in the country and we can't call 911. It was because we want to be able to kill these dudes that we're mistreating in case they get the upper hand on us, right? Because they knew they were doing something wrong. And, that has been, has metastasized into this gun culture, just disgusting, despicable, display of Americanism, and we've lost a constitutional process. And we did that for a 75-year-old drug addict in diapers, who everything about his life is Russian. He's been married 3 times, one of them was an American woman. The rest of them were from Eastern Europe. He's in love with Russia. His buildings are full of Russians and Chinese nationals and stuff. There's nobody more un-American than Donald Trump, right? But he's convinced all these people in middle America that he is the true patriot. And now there's all this infighting with these QAnon freaks. They're all at each other's throats. And of course, Lauren Boebert had the anti-Muslim slur against Ilhan Omar that everybody saw, which was basically a stand-up routine, Jimmy. She was doing stand-up. That's what you do. You tell a story and you got a big punchline, and her punchline was insult comedy. That works fine at the Comedy Cellar or whatever, or the Stand or wherever. There's a lot of bro comedians. I'm sure that would kill in Austin if you're opening up for Joe Rogan, right?
Yeah.
But for a sitting congressman to say that kind of dangerous rhetoric, 20 years after 9/11, when American Muslims were persecuted here at home through xenophobia, Islam is a religion of peace. Just to cast that aspersion is disgusting. Terrorism and Islam, the Muslim religions were co-opted by terrorists that were looking out for their own interests, just like Christianity is being co-opted now by a bunch of fundamentalists in the South, trying to convince people who have less that they're fighting a holy war to attack the evil liberals and communists and stuff. You know what I mean? She is closer to a terrorist than Ilhan Omar or anybody she's attacking. You know what I'm saying? But it's red meat for the base, just like all this gun talk. And I'm getting to the point here, that's domestic tranquility. That's jarring. She took away any sense of peace that a Muslim American family would have on Thanksgiving when they had to see that. People have to explain that to their kids that are going to see that. People who have every right to live and prosper in health, and feeling safe in their own country. We have elements in this country that are actively trying to take it away from fellow Americans. And that's in opposition of our Constitution. And we have to stand up to it soon because we're becoming defenseless, right? We got an Omicron virus now because a bunch of morons wouldn't wear masks and get vaxxed. Now we're wide open for the next wave of this thing, that could rip through here like wildfire. You could not leave your bedroom again for 6 months, Jimmy. You're compromised, right? You're more vulnerable than some. Are you straight up good?
And I'm healthier among my friends with disabilities. Like, I'm not worried about it as someone who would be wheelchair bound. But, this week, talk about disturbing domestic tranquility. You had a former sitting president of the United States take a picture with Kyle Rittenhouse this week, and what Lauren Boebert said is right on brand with what Trump said as president when he told 4 congresswomen who happened to be Arab to go back to the country where you came from. It was xenophobia all over again, right on brand. And the thing that kills me, I come from a Bible Belt state in Indiana, or, we have the doctrine and we are God-fearing Americans here. This group was the moral majority, and now they're in the pews chanting, "Let's go, Brandon." I think somewhere along the line, you missed the concept of, like, love and compassion in Catholicism. Like the way that Christianity has metastasized into something cancerous, and just for them to, absolve themselves of all sin because they're reading the right book, screw you. You've lost the concept of it a long time ago.
Yeah, well said, Jimmy. And don't curse, because I get hate mail from our viewers. They blame me if you curse.
Well, you've been a bad influence on me, Noel.
I know. They get upset, but
yeah, like the paradigm between religion and politics now is scary, and there's supposed to be separation of church and state for a reason.
Yeah, well, I talk about another,
Yeah.
Constitutional promise. It was the right to worship as you see fit. And they're, Lauren Boebert's comments were the second one, like, right? Wasn't Gosser or somebody recently was like, or somebody was like, there's only one religion in America.
Michael Flynn at a QAnon event.
Right. There you go. Exactly. Like, hey, right. There's only one God, and we're going to tell you who that is. And if you don't believe us, I'm going to stick this sword through your gut. Right. That's what Christianity was when they had these purges and, all this like persecution, like people do evil things in the name of religion, because most religions, let's face it, they're concepts for men to remain dominant over their followers or women and stuff. This stuff is made up by men. Okay. Like Jesus is not going to come back and be like, yeah, Mike Flynn, that's my dude. Like he's going to be like, you guys are out of your freaking minds. I gave you masks. I gave you smart scientists, that came up with vaccines. It's 2 years later and you're still dodging these bullets. Right? Because you got political people exploiting it, right? Everybody is vaccinated at Fox News. Everybody who's working on Rupert Murdoch's yacht is vaccinated, okay? His house in Mayfair, his townhouse on Fifth Avenue, all have Le Creuset cookware in them. I promise you, okay? When his coq au vin is prepared, it's done so in a fine French enamel, Dutch oven, okay? But they went off on Kamala Harris because she bought a $500 pot. The same people that are riding around in $60 pickup trucks that they're getting on 4-year leases with no money down, getting 17 miles to the gallon, talk about wasting money, So, but it's a culture war, it's so effective, Jimmy, because the theme this week is going to be that loss of domestic tranquility, because that wears you down. People get like, I can't even deal with this anymore. I just got to shut off the phone. And obviously social media is gasoline on these fires, and it's designed to get you angry and to keep paying attention and stuff, and think that your opinion has to immediately be out there on something, and I'm top of that list. Obviously, I'm tweeting all the time, and because I'm pissed. I went to sleep pissed. I didn't want to, but it's like, people don't really fully understand, I think, what went down, what Trump truly is. He's a con man his whole life. He was a criminal. Had he not grown up wealthy, he would have been dead or in jail by the time he was 21, just for how he treated the people around him. Okay. If he was a poor kid in the Bronx, he would have gotten his ass kicked by somebody else's dad, or murdered by some girl's brother that he, assaulted. Okay. The guy was a known predator. When I worked at NBC, they would tell women, like, stay away from him. You don't want to be alone with him. He would have cameras in Trump Tower in the contestants' suites that they gave him. He used to have these like beauty pageants, and he would like invite the girls to the US Open and then molest them in the skybox when they went to the bathroom. And I worked on the US Open. Like, this stuff was no secret, and no matter how much you scream it from the rooftops, the mainstream media never really wanted to look at that, because there was a buck to be made. Jeff Zucker knew this stuff, but he's at NBC at the time, and he made a fortune off of Celebrity Apprentice on a Sunday night, which is a hard night to make any money in TV, until they got the football or whatever. But, so a lot of Americans were duped into believing that this con man had their best interests at heart. And then the whole thing has been packaged by all these right-wing nutbags and by the emergence of Marjorie Taylor Greens and all these sort of professional trolls that are causing all this disturbance and this smoke. But while this is happening, the folks at the state level are gerrymandering districts, right? They're passing these laws. And in Wisconsin now, like 80% of the representatives sent to Washington are going to be Republicans, no matter how it breaks, no matter if more Democrats show up to vote, it's skewed to send Republicans to DC. And that's happening in 4 or 5 states. And that's what nobody's paying attention to. You know, those voter suppression bills, like we didn't get a voters' bill of rights because Manchin and Sinema are paid by the Koch brothers to not let it happen. Right. You know, so while all this distraction, and not just distraction, these are real issues, but while all this kind of, you know, really, you know, fiery rhetoric is happening, and while these trolls are sucking up all the oxygen, people are doing real kind of damage behind the scene, and folks are going to wake up and they're going to be like, what happened? You know, how did we just lose the Senate and the Congress? And then it's too late. Then it's just a slow descent into authoritarianism, you know, and Trump will engineer some kind of pardon where he gets to pick, you know, Ivanka becomes president or something, you know, as long as he never gets prosecuted. My personal gut is he would cut a deal with DeSantis, even though he hates him. You know, he'd pick like a favorite son and say, you know, I get to keep half of the money that the RNC raises. You can never go after me or my family, and I'll give you my blessing, you know? And they all know this. The GOP knows he's the kingmaker. They know he's got over $80 million in a war chest, which he'll keep for himself, but he'll threaten to primary his opponents. And there's no men in the GOP. These are small little like insects, right? I shouldn't say that word about a human being because I like insects better than I like Kevin McCarthy. But we see the moral fiber of these men. They have none. They're Mike Pence's. They're spineless cowards that are afraid of their own shadows, their own humanity, their own sexuality in many cases, right? They're afraid to be who they obviously are to anybody who's ever met them, right? But they live in a religion that says, I can't be this way, you know? And so that metastasizes into aggression, you know, and into promoting authoritarianism because it makes them feel better about who they are, you know, and it's dangerous. I don't think this country's ever faced the danger it really does now. And, you know, and I was hoping to be lighthearted on this podcast this week. You're in trouble, folks. You're already like so close to like crossing a line that you can't come back from. And I don't know if enough people realize that. So many people want to be like, I got my blue wave emoji, we're just going to vote them out. Well, you're not. If they're passing these bills, you're going to have minority ruling the majority. And that has been a successful, you know, like a successful dynamic for authoritarian places, you know, and awful, immoral places like South Africa to rule for a very long time, right? Apartheid was the rule for a long time. There was a lot of governments, all of Europe went into Africa, and they colonized it and abused those people forever and stole their resources forever until it finally they couldn't anymore. So, you know, who are we to think it couldn't happen here? We're not even the smartest kids on the block by a mile. Right? Germans were a hell of a lot smarter than your average American in the 30s. They were the highest educated, you know, country in Europe, and they fell for that shit.
Well, and you know, when they burned down the government building in Germany, the Reichstag, Hitler came there and was like, had pride about it. You know, he wasn't, oh my God, the government's burning, you know. All the symbol, if you haven't watched it yet, watch the mini series about Tyrants on Netflix. Okay, it goes through all the different ones throughout history to this point, including Kim Jong Il, the current leader of North Korea. Trump's got all the characteristics, you know, all the same things that they utilize to try to dupe their people. Trump's doing the same thing. I mean, watch the documentary. It explains it a lot better than I can in a short bit, but it breaks it all down, and the same indicators are there for 45, you know?
Well, there you go. So check that out, folks. Jimmy's picks on Netflix. And look, you know, you mentioned Kim Jong-il.
Yeah.
Trump has a picture of them meeting like two lovers over the North Korean, like the line of demarcation or whatever, right?
They wrote love letters.
Right, but literally the picture is on his wall at Mar-a-Lago. And if you saw his photo op with little doughboy murderer, right?
Right.
That picture is right behind him. Like it was the most absurdest thing with those idiots giving a thumbs up and that picture of you know, a guy who killed his own like brother-in-law with an anti-aircraft gun, or his uncle or whatever, you know, like the fact that Trump would have a monster like that on his wall, that's like having a picture of Charles Manson. Kim Jong-il starves his people to death. I mean, it's horrific. They're in work camps starving to death. Like, he is as big a monster as this world has ever seen. He's like Pol Pot. It's horrific. And Trump doesn't mind that. He loves that brutality, that toxic masculinity brutality has always been a part of Trump world. It's why Don Jr. has the guns and shoots elephants. It's why they would have Hell's Angels and Chuck Zito at the after parties. They were trying to, UFC fighting, all this kind of like the trappings of weak men, right? I'm a tough guy. No, you're not. You're a pussy, dude. Anybody with a Punisher sticker on their car is a coward, because you need to show people you're tough. Real tough guys don't do that. Real tough guys don't need to advertise it, right? Inferior men do that because they know deep down they're inferior, because they had a daddy who used to slap them around like Trump did, and tell him he was an idiot, and that Trump Jr. does to his kids. Look at a picture of Don Jr. with his children sometime, and you'll see 4 abused kids, 3 abused kids. They hate him. He just posted another picture the other day, and people are like, how do you even post this? Your kids are like one phone call away from Child Protective Services. You never seen a sadder looking group of kids, because they pass it on. They pass it on, the abuse. And Trump was abused by his dad, and he was like a bad seed from the beginning, right? It was like, Jeffrey Dahmer or something, like a psychopath. He really is. I mean, people laugh. They don't understand. He started grooming my friend when she was 12 years old. She ended up in Jeffrey Epstein's townhouse, and she said, "Noel, you will not believe the stuff they did to women in there. Not just having sex with, prostitutes. I mean, abusing, violent, horrific stuff. That was part of the cheap thrill that these billionaires did, that they could get away with this stuff. Because you're a bit rich guy, you can go to any bar and pick up a girl or whatever, right? You're a billionaire. It's like, you're going to have people, that are going to give you attention no matter what, but it becomes this status to like, no, I need a 14-year-old virgin and stuff. That's what it becomes about with these wealthy men. And a lot more of them were in on it than just Donald Trump. That's why you never heard about Jeffrey Epstein. That's why they whacked him in a jail cell. Because you had Prince Andrew, and you have all these American like billionaires and Giuliani and all these other freaks that were in on it. And, Donald Barr, Bill Barr's father, So it's, it's the same thing. It's like, nobody wants to look at how seedy this is, but you let a seedy psychopath have an enormous amount of influence over half of this country. And you're not going to wrest that back now, because you have all these, as I said, these sort of like Lauren Boeberts and MGTs and all these little trolls running around, like exploiting it, making it stronger. The phone's ringing, folks. I'm just going to let it ring. And that's going to become, that's like a weapon. Like Putin already launched a war against the US. It just happened differently than the Cold War, or a hot war. And he's going to go into Ukraine this week. Right. And nobody's going to do anything about it. Right. Because when we could have done something about it, Trump was cutting side deals and holding back military aid from the Ukraine, because he was trying to pressure them into saying Biden was crooked so he could win the next election. Like, people forgot about that. We let a sovereign nation basically get, weakened and harassed and attacked for the last 5 years from Russia. And now it's going to get invaded. And there's not going to be a damn thing the world can do about it. Because when we could have done something about it, we had a mob boss trying to get Giuliani to commit a shakedown so he could stay in office for a few more years and grift the United States. That's where we're at. And Biden and whoever ain't going to get us out of it overnight.
No. Well, and, one event that I think gets lost because of all the things that Trump did, it's the bed of nails theory. You do one bad thing, it hurts you. You do 1,000 bad things, it doesn't. One event that stood out to me when I thought about it today, because we're dealing with that infrastructure bill that just passed, Joe Biden was able to do something that Trump talked about for 4 years, but could never do. Do you know what the original purpose of that meeting in Trump Tower was? When they talked about like Charlottesville and he got really angry, it was supposed to be about infrastructure. That was supposed to be when Trump was going to reveal his grand plan of how to get us highways and all the things that we need. But no, he made it about him and the Charlottesville thing. And as he's leaving, instead of saying, oh, what a horrible tragedy that a woman was run over by protesters, He says, "Oh, I have a winery in Charlottesville."
Right.
He's promoting his business. He's on Team Trump.
And all the kids are, and that's all they've ever been on.
Right.
It's his biggest scam. And just sadly, America was ripe to get scammed because of the domestic tranquility, because people thought it would feel good to hate their neighbors, to resent immigrants. You should be kissing their ass and trying to learn something from them and welcoming them into your community. Every time I get I'm impressed these days with service, or a waiter or like a tradesman. It's always an immigrant. It's always an immigrant, never fail. And every time I have a problem, it's an American, quote unquote. It's a white guy who takes my check as a contractor and doesn't fucking call back for 6 months, right? Because there's a sense of entitlement and stuff. Like, you want people that are eager to work and work their way up the ladder and build a better country. But it's so complex now. It's so it's hard to explain to people that they're really getting screwed by Jeff Bezos. They're really getting screwed by these jobs that are never going to lift them into the middle class, that it doesn't exist anymore, that it's basically 1%ers and then everybody else struggling. A $400 medical bill shouldn't break you. It break your bank, and it does for most families now, or for a huge majority. Like, it's disgusting. It's sad. And you fall below that line, you're on the streets. Too many Americans are living too close to peril. And with that comes addiction, depression, violence, all kinds of, sort of byproducts of living the wrong way, of inequality, of a lack of balance, of a lack of nutrition holistically. Do you know what I'm saying? Like,
I do, man.
Right. And that's where we're at. We're sick. Like, we need Oprah. We need somebody to come in and say, y'all all need a timeout. You know what I mean? Like, we need to heal this nation, and fast. Right. Because now we're just throwing salt on the wounds, and it's like the longest journey in life, they say, is from your head to your heart. Right. And we're all in our heads now, and we're all angry, and we're all in our amygdala, whatever it's called, but you're
the Abdullah Oblongata.
Right. Whatever that gland that sort of regulates fear and stuff, we're all reacting to things from fear and anger, because underneath anger is just fear, right? You're just angry because you're scared of something. You feel threatened. Somebody's going to take something you don't have, and you're not going to get what you want. Right. That's a very common trait in addiction. I have that sort of thing about anything. I'll react to it like, oh God, my life's over. Like, I'm never going to make it, or whatever. What is making it anyway? Right. Making it is just being present and having some peace in your life. It's not career goals. But my point is, that's an easy thing to exploit. And Trump knew how to exploit that instinctually, because he's an addict himself. Right. So he lives in self-centered fear and resentment. That's his natural state. And he knows how to trigger it in others, because what he did was manipulate people. First it'd be like, I need you to do this for me. I need you to do me this favor. Just find me these 11,473 votes. That's all I need. Right. You heard him with Raffensperger almost a year ago, and that alone should have landed him in jail. You had a tape recording of the president of the United States calling up a secretary of state and trying to shake him down to overturn an election. And we're 6 weeks away from the anniversary of that, the 1-year anniversary of that, and nothing was done. Nothing was done about it. And that's who I've seen all my whole life with Trump. He gets away with everything, and he's getting away with it now. And thankfully, Don Wilson and some of these people on Twitter are like, dudes, what are you doing? You know what I mean? It wasn't that big of a victory to, subpoena Steve Bannon, right? Or indict him or whatever. He's just going to use it to promote his freaking podcast. Right? You need to round these guys up as the treasonous villains that they are, and have public hearings. So you lay out the facts for America, just like the Nuremberg trials, right? Germany would have hid that in a heartbeat if we let them, what they did in the camps and stuff. American troops made German citizens go in there and see what you did, see what happened here. So it never happened again. And now we're hiding, authoritarians, white supremacists, anti-Semites, we're allowing them to get away with attacking the US Capitol, murdering police officers. And it's a year later and nobody's held accountable. I mean, that's crazy. That's crazy, dude.
It is. And, you know, let's think back to like when Clinton was president. Okay. This is during his impeachment and that whole thing, that whole craziness, which kind of got this divide started. That was the beginning of that. But can you imagine Bill Clinton being in the White House, or even in private life, taking a picture with Timothy McVeigh after, you know, the Oklahoma City bombing? They would have him impeached within 5 minutes if something like that surfaced, you know. But that, again, man, it's so polarized. We can't even come together on basic ideas of sovereignty.
Because we're getting played, you know, we're not calling it out as it is. There's bad actors. Joe Manchin works for the Koch brothers, right? He just said on Thanksgiving that Biden should reopen the Keystone XL pipeline. That's a pipeline that brings shale oil down from the tar pits in Alberta into Nebraska, right? That's the crappy kind of oil that is hard to crack, right? Cracking is how you turn it into like usable oil, right? It's a process. Guess who refined that process and owns most of the, you know, manufacturing for that process? The Koch brothers, right? That's their main game, right? Fracking and crude oil and moving stuff through pipelines, right? He works for them, right? So on Thanksgiving, he's literally like, Biden needs to reopen the Keystone XL pipeline. And he uses it because of high gas prices. We need to get a reserve again. No, because your boys told you to do that. And now you're going to hold up, you know, the Senate's part of the infrastructure bill all through December. All through December, it's going to be him and Manchin. Watch, Jimmy, in your timeline every day. Well, we don't know what she wants, but she's not ready to vote on it for this because they're bought and paid for. And we're not calling it out like it is. We're acting like we can play by the old rules. Well, we need him. Otherwise, we'd have a Republican from West Virginia. Well, you already do have a Republican, you know, maybe show what he is to the people, you know, and some of them will come around and you'll get a charismatic leader who challenges him. I find it very hard to believe there's not a natural born leader in the state of West Virginia, you know, who's smart enough to represent his own people and see they're being exploited by a dude who lives in a houseboat and drives a Maserati.
Yeah. And, you know, I saw a story on Rachel Maddow the other day. Kevin Strickland, he was a guy that was released after 43 years of time served in Missouri. And because of the rules that they have on the books, Missouri doesn't give out any kind of money for wrongly served prison time. Had that, you know, if you apply it to somewhere else, he's probably owed about $3 million. And thankfully, they have a GoFundMe page that's given him, you know, about $1.5 million to use how he sees fits to take care of himself. But how can Trump, you know, grift from our government as president of the United States, the chief law enforcement officer of our country, and this guy who, you know, was put in prison through no fault of his own, never committed the crime, can't even get $1 from our government?
I know. And
Trump's never paid.
Right. I know. And he never paid taxes.
Right. We still haven't seen his taxes, have we? The updated ones?
Nope. And that's what I'm talking about, Jimmy. We accepted this. People treat you how you allow them to treat you, Jimmy. Right? That's one of the rules in life. People only get away with what you allow them to get away with. If you stand up to a bully and punch him in the throat, he's going to think twice about calling you Fat Jimmy or whatever he said to you, right? I'm not saying you told me, right?
I've been called Fat Jimmy in the past. So, yeah.
Well, first of all, that's a mob boss name. That's a baller name. Okay. Yeah. That's like, you know, Fat Tony Salerno. Like, you know, when you're, hey, guys, Fat Jimmy wants to see you. You're
Fat
like,
Jimmy's a made man.
Right. You're in trouble. Fat Jimmy's calling you to the back of the bada bing. You know, you've done something wrong.
Right? Make you a deal you can't refuse.
So that's a baller name. I would take it, dude. But anyway, you know my point. You know, you punch a bully in the nuts, they think twice. That's the thing with Trump. Nobody ever stood up to him. And people were like, how come you talk about him? Because I know what he is. I know he's a freaking coward. Yeah, there's mob guys around him, but he screwed most of those guys over. It's really just the Russians left, you know, and yeah, they're brutal and ruthless, you know, but they're also a dumpster fire in their own right, you know? So if people had just called him out, but it got too messy and nobody wanted to deal with it. And he's also wealthy enough, like, yeah, he's a fake billionaire, right? But he was wealthy enough to tie you up in court forever. Summer Zervos just had to drop her suit because she couldn't afford the legal bills. He assaulted her and he got away with it because, after 5 years of paying $700 an hour to a lawyer, most people run out of money. Trump has law firms that'll do it for free for the publicity. I mean, they don't do it for free. They take the money, but now he grifts his followers, right? He sends out 15 texts a day.
You have the Republican Party paying for part of his SDNY stuff. That's
Exactly.
Wild right there.
Exactly. That should have people in the street with pitchforks,
Well, and I'm tapping into like the immature part of myself. I'm not actually calling for this, but I am surprised with all of the, Ted Cruz, Lauren Boebert. How have none of those guys at least, had a punch headed toward their face with what they're saying? If I was working with them, I would have a hard time not punching them in the face. I would take the consequence. I would. I would go to jail or face the felony, even as an elected official. I know I'm going to get out of there soon. It's worth, I don't know. I would like to see Eric Swalwell or somebody throw a punch before this thing is over, just to see the clip.
Yeah. I'd like Madison Cawthorn, just like roll him fucking Anacostia or something.
Yeah. Maybe you incorporate his wheelchair in that whole thing. He loves his wheelchair.
That guy's a psycho. That guy, he's not worth our time, but that's a troubled dude. He's got trouble, written all over him, like deep trauma. He was probably an asshole before he got in a car wreck.
He thinks he's Professor X or something. Like, dude, he just needs to give it up.
He told people after the Rittenhouse thing to get violent, like that should be against the law right there. And there's no censure, right? They censure Paul Gosar, but like drag him out of there in handcuffs. His own family's telling you he's a psycho killer. Madison Cawthorn is clearly looking to commit violence. He's inciting people to commit violence. He just had some other outrageous thing he said the other day. They all hide behind the Constitution to bring it back to the theme of this show. You think Madison Cawthorn can sit there and name amendments in a Constitution? No. The guy's homeschooled and he writes like a 4-year-old girl.
Uh-huh. He's got his Britney Spears pen, with the glitter, what he likes.
No, it's just insane. A bunch of morons, and like we're accepting it, and we have to stop accepting it. And ultimately, I do have faith in the American people that they will see through the ruse. But it's going to require a different way of sort of receiving information, and it's going to require taking some action against Fox News. You're not going to save this republic while Fox News gets to do what they do with impunity, because their reach is just too vast. And you can say their numbers are down, but you got CNN, which is Fox News light, right? They're doing everything they can to say, oh, Biden's screwing up gas prices. You should be paying $5 a gallon for gas. They've been doing it in Europe for decades, right? Gas should be much more of a luxury product than it is, because it's destroying the planet. It's why you're getting all these extreme storms. Okay. So you don't have a right to fill up a giant pickup truck that gets 17 miles to the gallon and then bitch about it and then elect an authoritarian, because you don't want to pay high gas prices. And if you don't think it's related, if you don't think CNN and Joe Manchin and all these guys are working in concert with each other to keep that unrest, to keep that sort of, that's not how you measure the health of a nation, is what it costs at the gas pump. We shouldn't be using carbon fuels anymore. We should be phasing them out as quickly as we can, and finding alternative modes of public transportation. It's not just electric cars, because you got to burn coal to get electricity, right? But we should be tackling that problem. And in Europe, at least they're confronting it, and they drive small cars. We're just in denial. Cars are getting bigger. Like, I cannot believe it. I'm a child of the 70s. Okay. The first big gas crisis was when I was a kid. And that's when Hondas and all these tiny cars came in. And it's like, hey, look, you can fill the whole thing up for $20 and go 300 miles. Or you could drive a Dodge Duster that gets 10 miles a gallon, which my mom drove. She was always in these old ass jalopy muscle cars, which I hated at the time, and now they'd be like awesome to have one of them just to, restore it or something. But like Plymouth Furies and these just crazy big cars. And that's just insane to me that 50 years later, people are still driving these giant, like gas guzzling behemoths. And then you have politicians sort of dumbing down the populace to be like, Biden's paying nothing, Biden's doing nothing, and gas is $5 a gallon. I drove from New York to Philly, from Philly back to New York. You pass a lot of goddamn gas stations, okay? Because you got to go through New Jersey, which is one big gas station and oil refinery with a couple beaches and some pizza parlors. Let's be real, right?
Right.
Okay. And some beautiful women and some great rock and rollers. I got love for Jersey, but it's basically the petrol state, right? The whole thing is an oil refinery. You get in outside of Manhattan and you drive through the wetlands and all these areas that were once gorgeous, beautiful, like natural wonders of the world. And they've been turned into like shipping, ports and refineries and stuff. And it's sad, but that's all for fossil fuels, right? That's all modern stuff. And then you drive down through Philly and you pass all these gas stations. And I had like the MSNBC and CNN on the, Xfinity, whatever you call the radio thing, and Sirius XM, where I've actually been a guest on several shows. But anyway, all you heard the whole 2 days was about gas prices.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, that's just, you're getting manipulated. There's more complex issues. Yeah, it sucks. You got to pay more at the pump and you got to adjust accordingly. Right. But it's not the metric of how you measure a successful president who just inherited a global pandemic, a con man who was just feeding his own family, grifting every dime he could out of the federal budget. Right. He spent $150 million going to golf courses, and they're mad about a vice president who spent $500 of her own money on some beautiful cookware. Le Creuset is the best cookware in the world, Jimmy. It's enamel coated, like incredible stuff, and the cheap Teflon shit they sell you at Walmart will give you cancer. John Oliver just did an episode on that. So that stuff's poison. If you use non-stick stuff, it'll eventually, get to you. And most humans in America have the chemical that is off-gassed by that in their system already. Just an aside, John Oliver did a brilliant episode on that. So nobody brings that up, but that's the other side of like Le Creuset is like, that's enamel, on like cast iron cookware. It's like a healthy thing to do,
Right.
So, but my point is they're manipulating these people with these, with these sort of catchphrases and these things that hit everybody, in their pocketbook. And somebody like CNN knows it's easier to run that kind of stuff over the holiday weekend because it's going to get people emotionally, right? And it's easier than explaining these complexities, explaining that Joe Manchin is working for the Koch brothers and he's going to obfuscate and stand in the way of progress in the Senate now because that's the next thing on his list. Because we negotiated with them before, and that's the problem. That's why they say you don't sort of do business with the mob, because they're always going to ask you for more, right? And that's what these guys are doing now because they know they have him over a barrel, right? So it's easier to just focus on that or let Chris Christie have his upteenth interview, right?
Yeah.
So he can sell his book that didn't even sell 12,000 copies and make the New York Times bestseller list. But it's easier to have that like corpulent con man on yet another show. Yeah, I'm going to tell you a story about Chris Christie. You'll probably like, Jimmy. Okay. He was a starting catcher on his high school baseball team when he was a junior, right? Mm-hmm. And then an all-state catcher was transferring into his district, right? Yeah. Like a real badass. And Christie's dad intervened to get that kid's transfer like nullified and stuff because he didn't want his son to lose his position on the baseball team. Yeah. And I think it didn't work, and Christie had to sit on the bench most of the season anyway. But like, that's the kind of guy he is. When he was a free holder, he lied to the cameras about his opponent. He was just he's an awful guy, and he's always been an awful guy, and he's not that experienced. He got lucky, as I said, after Bush appointed him because the Democrats were giving Bush anything he wanted. So Chris Christie wanted to be the federal prosecutor, and Democrats were like, all right, just let him, because he was the Bush campaign's lawyer during Bush's 2000 campaign, right? Okay. Which is why Nicole Wallace tore him a new one, because she knows all that. She knows her old boss basically made Christie's career because he was a prosecutor for 2 years and then he ran for governor and won. Because after 9/11, we were in this law and order kind of mode. Republicans were very popular then because they were seen as, the guys that could tackle terrorism, and in reality, they were the guys that were profiting off the wars and making a fortune, and they were going to ride off into the sunset and go finger painting in Texas. But At the time, everybody was down for this. And it was a mistake, like it always is, because it was a more complex issue, right? Whenever anything is knee jerk, let's just wave a flag and kick some ass. That's the wrong answer. Go deep, look deeper,
But see, Chris, and you've talked about it, just the way it works, the fraternity of the mediocre white man. The other half of that is that Chris Christie knows, even with the GOP at this state, he has to, continue to shake hands with the friends that be, the powers that be, so that system is maintained. It's you get help from friends as long as you help the friends back. It's a very transactional thing. As Trump, everything that Trump does is transactional. There's no emotional kind of energy exchange with Trump, because it's purely how he can use people.
Yeah, it's all transactional. And the kids are transactional. Jared and Ivanka had a transactional wedding, Wendy Dang Murdoch. They broke up. When I first started working with them, they had broken up because Jared wasn't down with it. Trump would call him the Jew, is the Jew here yet? Like, he was like, these guys are idiots, because Kushner's, whatever you say about them, they were a little more sophisticated than Trump's are naturally. Besides Mary Trump, who's great and extremely intelligent, the rest of them are dumbasses, because they're growing up with a dad who put gold leaf on everything and ate cheeseburgers. It wasn't like they're cultured people, like they grew up going to like Miss Teen USA contests and stuff, So Kushner was out of there originally. They were just dating when I first met him, and then they came back and all of a sudden got married. And that's because Wendy Dang Murdoch took Ivanka on a cruise in the Mediterranean off the coast of Turkey and was like, you need to get back with him. And Wendy Dang Murdoch was Putin's girlfriend at the time. Okay. She'd been married to Rupert Murdoch. Like, she was, some say, a Chinese spy, but she was very involved in sort of like, she's a Ghislaine Maxwell type. Right. Okay. Somebody who was like pulling the strings behind the scenes and said, this is a marriage of convenience and you need to get back together for power. And it worked out real well for Kushner, because he got to get his own dossiers on everybody for 4 years in the White House and sell secrets to the Middle East. Right. Yeah. And now KSA, Saudi Arabia is going to pay him for his new wealth fund, and he's going to make billions of dollars and be a Bond villain for the rest of his life. He's not going to be held accountable. Right. The Trump kids are not going to be held accountable. Maybe Eric Trump will face some charges. They'll throw him to the wolves. And who wouldn't? As I said on Twitter, he's the burner son anyway, right? Yeah. And they found out he used a burner phone to talk to Mark Meadows on January 6th. Yeah. That alone should be like, stop the presses, have the FBI, drive in a convoy up to Trump Tower tomorrow morning and drag that dude out in handcuffs. What do you mean he was using a burner phone to communicate with the chief of staff of the White House when the government was getting attacked? Right. When the other 3 people in the secession of power were inside a building. You have the president's son on a burner phone talking to Mark Meadows. Like, what? I've never had a burner phone. I used to do drugs. Like, I didn't never need a burner phone. Like, that's some next level narcos type shit. And that's who these guys are. They are mobsters. They are career criminals, but they did it in the open, and they did it by doing enough business with the establishment that it made them untouchable. That's why I'm always pointing that stuff out with CNN and NBC and stuff. People didn't really want to go after them because it's too much of a headache. New York Times doesn't really want to write about all the sexual predation that Trump has done, because it's unseemly. And there's other people that did business with Trump that are going to get caught into that we own stocks in, and that I need to write a letter so my kid gets into Penn. Right. It's all intermingled. And Trump, as dumb as he was, understood that. He wasn't allowed into society because he was an idiot. Right. So he couldn't get into Maidstone. It's a nice club in East Hampton. And, Fifth Avenue society never accepted him. He's from Queens and he's boorish. And he married these trashy looking women that's not how it rolls. Right. But he was able to buy his way into a certain amount of the firmament of, New York City political life. That's why the Clintons were at his wedding, right. Which is a mistake of the Clintons, and obviously they regret that, but that's how it is. He bought fancy friends.
Well, Here's my question to you, and it's probably just me being naively positive about how I think this world could work. But, we were in the Middle East for 20 years when we knew that it wasn't a winnable war. Does there come a point when Putin and these folks are like, all right, we've made our money. We can let them have democracy again, or is it just a continuation that they hope to maintain, and then we become like serfs, basically?
We are like serfs, basically,
Yeah.
dude. That's what I was saying about income inequality.
Right.
Your bigger fear on that is your American oligarchs, your Jeff Bezoses, your what is his name? The Tesla dude who's clearly out of his mind.
Elon.
Yeah, that guy's a Bond villain. Okay. And his family money was made off of emerald mines in South Africa, where they basically enslaved people in the apartheid state to work the mines. And then he made a bunch of money and came here. That guy's going to end up fleeing the country. Mark my words, listeners. Okay. Elon Musk will be in Switzerland, in the next 5 to 10 years. He'll have to leave this country because he's just so shady and so out of his mind. But that's where your serfdom will come from, because you're working at Walmart or Dollar Tree or one of these places. You're not climbing out of that poverty. Not if the government won't give you health care and Medicaid, right? Joe Manchin cut free community college out of this bill that we're just talking about. That was one of the things he was like, nope, that's a deal breaker. You got to take it out. And Biden took it out. Why does a guy like that want people not to have an education, especially when he represents the 50th state in terms of poverty and education? Because that's what the Koch brothers want. The Koch brothers took their model from what their dad learned by building oil refineries in Russia under Stalin. Okay. People don't know that, but that's where the Koch brothers came from. Their father, Frederick Koch, was good at, as I said, this gets complicated, but cracking this crude oil is the process you use to refine it. The oil they had in Russia was especially rough. It was just like the cheap shit. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And the Koch brothers, Frederick Koch, whatever, the dad stole this other guy's invention, basically took this other guy's patent where he started in Kansas and stuff, and took it as his own and patented it and stuff. And so that process of cracking, refining this oil was very helpful in Russia because they had a lower grade oil, right? So Koch was able to go in there and do it really cheaply and stuff. And then he basically decided he didn't like Stalin and came back to the US and set up his dynasty, and then became one of the founders, of John Birch Society and all this kind of stuff, and got involved in libertarianism and stuff. Okay. Mm-hmm. One of the first things that they funded, sort of being against, was Social Security, unions, things like that, things that keep, things that will work against your interests if you want a bunch of serfs. If you want an endless supply of people to work in your factories and not be able to do anything about it because they're working for the company store, mm-hmm. Sign up for libertarianism. So that's why they want people sort of dumb, ignorant, impoverished, unhealthy, because there's an endless supply. They're not going to make it up that ladder far enough to threaten you, right? That's also why you have things like no abortion and stuff. So you have an endless supply of workers, right? That sounds crude, but all these things work together, and you have to call it out as such. So that's where Manchin's coming from. That's where they couch these ideas of it's communism to have free healthcare. No, it's not. It's common sense is what it is. You shouldn't have to pay for that. If we're paying for missiles and bombs and all this kind of crap to pay for armies that can be called up on a moment's notice by Dick Cheney to go invade some country so Kellogg Brown Root can have a more profitable year, and we got to pay for that, then we should be able to pay for people to get educated, to have Wi-Fi, to have health care, right? But he was against all that. He was against expanding Medicaid. You have to ask these people why they're doing it. You can't accept their answers. And too many Democrats are accepting Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema and not looking at the deeper motivations behind these eminently corrupt people.
Well, and, I'm going to go even a level deeper, because you talked about how it's difficult to find a job. They say there's so many jobs available. Does it pay a living wage? One of the things that I run into is it costs a lot of money to look for work, whether you're talking about like clothes, transportation to interviews, internet access to apply for jobs. Like that's what this infrastructure bill will address. But that's a common problem, that it doesn't allow poor people to elevate themselves in any way.
And that's part of the whole thing. That's the point I'm trying to make. It's very expensive to be poor in this country, Jimmy. If you're rich, you get low interest loans. People are giving you stuff. It's like being a celebrity. You get all the stuff for free. When you can afford to buy the sunglasses, they give them to you for free, right? Because you're going to the Grammys and they're in their gift bag, right? It's expensive to be poor. Poor people pay a higher rate to just survive. They have to go to check cashing places, right? And pay a commission to cash their checks. They have to get payday loans, these draconian loans that Trump and Betsy DeVos put back into, circulation and his administration, these things that are just ripping people off, credit cards where you're paying 20% interest and stuff, right? That's all designed to keep people subservient, getting on a bus, and going 2 hours to work at the Dollar Tree for $8 an hour. Well, the CEO of Dollar Tree makes $10 million a year. How does a guy make $10 million a year in a store where everything costs $1 or $1.25, where it's just a bunch of crap, that like they bought surplus from China, right? And the guy who's running that business is making $10 million a year, and the people working in those stores are working 12-hour shifts at $7 an hour, right? That is, I don't know if feudalism is the right word, but that's what you're describing. That's a nation of serfs. And they're right at the point where you're never going to get above that level, especially if we're sort of warring internally, right? If we've lost domestic tranquility, because everyone's mad at everyone else and you're not seeing who you should really be mad about. And that's what they want. That's what they want. So that's the end of my rant on domestic tranquility. We'll talk for a few more minutes here. I don't want to, we're coming up on an hour. I don't want to bum the listeners out too much, Jimmy, but, I was in Philly this week, as I said, and Philly has had some great music, man. Philly music, Philly soul has always had a big influence on me, from Gamble and Huff to Eddie Pendergrass. I worked with somebody who was one of his managers, and my friend Lisa Barbarise, and she's Cyndi Lauper's manager for the last bunch of years, but she was Teddy's guy. Teddy was great. There was a guy named Jeffrey Gaines when I was a kid, who's this incredible singer songwriter. And I'm down with the whole like Roots crew and Adam Blackstone, who I mentioned last week, who's one of the best MDs you'll get in live TV. He's a great bass player. So Philly just kicked out so much kick-ass music, and we're going back to Coltrane lived in Philly. He saw Charlie Parker play as a kid. So it was cool to be there and be reminded of what a rich cultural heritage that city has. And so I've been on a Philly kick. So I listened to some Boyz II Men last night and put on a Boyz II Men documentary, and my other friend Amanda was one of Boyz II Men's like tour managers in their height, and they came out when I was probably 20 or something. So I was a little older than their demo, like if you were in high school, but I think people forget how amazing Boyz II Men were. And they kicked off that whole boy band surge,
Right.
They really, you had, I guess, new Kids on the Block, was out of Boston.
Yeah.
And, but like Boyz II Men sort of perfected that 4-part harmony, just, really kick-ass sound. And some of the boy bands, they did 5-part harmony because they needed the cute one, the mysterious one, the goofy one, they had the formula down by then. But anyway, it was just interesting. Jill Scott is from Philly. Jill Scott is you've probably never heard of Jill Scott, Jimmy, but she's a badass. And you wouldn't know any of this, son. I'm just educating you.
Oh, yeah.
So I like regional music, great scenes come out of like a place. Like everyone's talking about the Beatles this week, part of the magic is that these guys came from Liverpool, part of their sound were the influences that came into Liverpool, right? Because it was a shipping town. It was a port town. So they'd get records quicker in Liverpool than they'd get them in London, believe it or not, because sailors would bring them over and, they just bought the new Chuck Berry, when they were coming back, on the boat from America, or whatever. So they sort of had this like gumbo to some extent, that was the Mercy beat and early rock and roll. And, it it emulsified in the water, and these kids living under a common kind of cloud. And, and that being like post World War II England, which was decimated, after World War II. They really took a beating, obviously, and these kids grew up playing in like rubble, the Rolling Stones, like you read Keith Richards' autobiography, he's talking about playing like next in these buildings that had been bombed by the Germans, and sometimes they'd find an old shell or something, like it was all right there. The baby boomers people went home and had sex, right? And had a lot of bunch of babies, that's where these guys all came from, So there's something interesting when music is attached to a place, a very specific place, and then it sort of travels the world, and it ignites creativity in all these other places, And when I look at the legacy of the Beatles, who were kind of the high watermark, in sort of co-opted rock and roll, because people forget like African Americans already invented this shit. Okay. The Beatles weren't doing nothing new. They were covering songs that were recorded right here. Right. But it took a bunch of 4 white guys from England to introduce Americans to it, or the Rolling Stones, 5 guys, that were just playing Muddy Waters songs. And people are like, that's great. Where does that come from? Chicago, right up the road from you, son. But we didn't even know it, but that's how it worked out, because it had to be palatable for the American consumer, right? And 4 little white kids with funny haircuts in suits are a lot less threatening than Howlin' Wolf. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But anyway, that's how it worked out. And yeah, I'm not knocking them. The Beatles were obviously, touched by the hand of God in terms of talent, and George Martin was this brilliant producer. So they could go in there with an idea and he would just turn it into magic. But I like things that come from a region and it ignite other regional things. And the point I'm getting to is like, the greatest legacy for the Beatles to me is all the garage bands that they ignited in America. All the kids are like, that's what I want to do. When they saw the Beatles, every classic rock star I've worked for has the same story, right? They're like, I was watching Ed Sullivan, I saw the Beatles, and I was like, that's what I'm going to do, right? I'm going to get a guitar and I'm going to kick ass and rock and roll. And it launched 1 million bands, probably 500,000 garage bands were launched, by 1965 or something, and a couple of them turned into awesome bands. Most of them disappeared and whatever, but it ignited, creativity that continues to this day. And it's tied to place. It has an authenticity that, that sort of makes it last. I think that's what people recognize, in the Beatles, it was like, I can do that. Yeah. Right. I can do that. It's 4 guys. It's 3 chords. They're singing together in harmony. They're simple songs. I want to hold your hand. Yeah. Right. Like I can do that. And a lot of them did it,
My dad, I'm sure he would testify the same thing. I'm wearing his shirt today. Chooch and the Enchanters was launched as a result of him watching the Ed Sullivan Show and seeing Paul and John, on TV. And, he would do the, and then do the impersonations too. Cause it was, I kind of had to be a Beatles fan growing up with my dad. I'm not the biggest fan just because he talked about it so much that I wanted to kind of expand my horizons, but Chooch and the Enchanters wouldn't have happened without the Beatles. That's for damn sure.
Yeah. I mean, the Beatles were, John Lennon was a deity in the world I grew up in because I was raised by hippies, and the day John Lennon was killed, my mom woke me up crying, and, it's a memory that is seared into me. And, I would go to the Dakota every year and put a strawberry at Strawberry Fields. It was like a tradition I always had in New York. And I've met Yoko and I've met his kids, Sean and Julian. And I've probably told the story about the first time I met Paul McCartney on this show, but I got to do a lot of stuff with Paul McCartney. I was just talking with his guitar player, Brian, the other day, and his drummer follows me. He was an incredible Abe Laboriel Jr. So Crosby, Stills and Nash opened for Paul McCartney in Hyde Park, to give you one example. We did a show over there and went to a party afterwards, and, But McCartney's a New York guy. He doesn't live far from me on the Upper East Side. And of course, he's got a beautiful place in East Hampton. So he was always showing up at New York events. We did the big, firemen's concert for New York after 9/11. And he invited all all the crew to go on stage and sing Hey Jude. And my buddy Joey did it, And
Nice.
I remember the first time I did a show with Paul McCartney, we were doing a Fashion Rocks, VH1 Fashion Rocks thing. It was probably in the 90s, and they were honoring his daughter, Stella McCartney, who's a great designer. And, it was live TV. Dick Clark is still alive, or, live to tape. And I remember Dick Clark was the producer, and I had to take James Brown. We were shooting it at a place called the Paramount. It was originally the Felt Forum. It's a theater in Madison Square Garden. And it always gets renamed, but at this time it was, I think, called the Paramount. And so we had trailers outside. And I don't know, you wouldn't know this, Jimmy, but Madison Square Garden sits on top of Penn Station, which is a train station, right? Mm-hmm. So James Brown is in a trailer outside, and they're like, no, you got to take James out to his trailer, So I'm stage right upstairs, if anybody knows backstage at the Garden. And I have to cross the stage to get back out to like where, 8th Avenue is, this entrance I'm going to use. And I'm crossing the stage and with James Brown, and he stops and he's talking to somebody, and it's taken like a little bit. And I can't see who he's talking to because he's got these epaulets on, he's got his like James Brown thing, what I mean?
Yeah.
And all of a sudden Dick Clark comes on the thing and he's like, hey, we're back in 30 seconds, folks. 30 seconds, we're back on air, and I'm just here in the middle of the stage. So I'm like, James, we got to go, and my buddy, who's a stage manager, goes, no, I think you might want to let him say hello for a second. Do you see who he's talking to? And I'm like, no. And I pop around and it's Paul McCartney. And he looks dead at me and he goes, hi, I'm Paul. And he just shakes my hand. And I'm like, oh my God, Paul McCartney. Hey, I got to take James now. And Paul's like, no problem.
Oh, good.
So we walk outside, and we're coming out just as a train, had gotten into Penn Station, and a bunch of people are coming out the escalator. And New Yorkers will know this story because the escalators go right up onto this sort of promenade on 8th Avenue. So I walk out there just as hundreds of people come up this escalator, and I'm standing there with James Brown, and they all see James Brown, and they're like, hey, Little Richard. Oh my God, it's Little Richard. How you doing, Little Richard? And he's like, hey, how you doing? How you doing? And he waves to them all, and we keep walking. And I go, man, I'm sorry they called you Little Richard. He goes, I don't care. To them, I'm just another famous N-word.
Oh.
But he said N-word. He goes, I'm just another famous N-word, to them. Like he was used to it, and he kept walking, and it was so sardonic, and so James Brown and kind of insightful a thing to say, that he was going to play along. He wasn't going to be like, no, I'm actually James, But my point is, these guys were the architects, right? There's so much James Brown in the Beatles. There's so much Little Richard. Like it took outsiders to see what we already have, right? And in many cases, we're going to suffer that same fate now, or we could use that same boost, right? We still have so much as a nation. We have natural beauty. We have natural resources. We have, a good-hearted, primarily population. Many of us have gotten a little misguided, and we need some work, but there's still so many treasures here. It's almost like we need an outsider to be like, hey, calm down, guys. You don't need to burn this place up. A lot of this is, there's still some good meat on the bone, essentially. We just gotta, we gotta see it, right? So sometimes music allows us to do that, and the Beatles are a great example of that, because we're in another kind of tempest, like of international things like that. They came at the height of the Cold War, Cuban Missile Crisis, all this, we were in an existential crisis at that time too, right? And we're sort of facing another big challenge in a way we haven't since the 60s. So it's something to keep in mind, and also let's not forget, it's music that brings us together. It's the arts, right? When you think of the Beatles, you think of one thing: all you need is love, right? That's what you could distill the whole Beatles thing down into: love, right? And honesty, right? Because John Lennon was so great because he was honest. He was like, yeah, I used to beat my wife. Who says that? You'd never get an artist today admitting that, right? But he admitted it and changed. He was an awful person in many ways. Okay. I know guys who knew him very well. They're like, he wasn't the saint that everybody thinks he was. And he'd be the first to tell you that, You know, he was a great artist, but he was a difficult, complicated man who had a lot of trauma in his life and spent his life sort of working through it and telling people not to worship heroes. My favorite Lennon song is when he talks about don't believe in Beatles, don't believe in me, you know, like just believe in yourself, man. Look within. That's ultimately what that lesson is. Look within and you'll find love.
Yeah. Well, and you know, another one of their songs, a couple of them, come together and let it be. You know, a lot of their concepts can be applied universally, and it's why they're such magic. And one that he did, so I believe, is his solo career. I love "Imagine," you know, by John Lennon too. You know, that's the song for me. You know, that you call me a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. There are several people that embody that in everything that they do. Hopefully.
Yeah, no, that's a hymn. I mean, that's a beautiful sentiment that'll people listen to in 1,000 years and go like, oh, that's dope. You know, and that's, to me, that's my favorite work, is the early solo stuff of John Lennon, you know, and I don't want to get into a debate like comparing that to the stuff that like McCartney came up with, but like Wings, that stuff is awful, man. That shit is awful. Like, you know, and I'll get in trouble with my listeners, so I should probably just stop there, you know, but God, you know,
it took a step down.
Yeah, dude, you know, and at the same time, let's listen to the stuff the Stones were putting out, you know, at that period in the early 70s, Exile on Main Street and Sticky Fingers and Let It Bleed, you know, and I'm a Stones guy. Like, that's my stuff right there, you know, because I like a harder edge to things, you know, and Lennon had a hard edge, you know. Graham Nash told me a story once. You know, Mama Cass was a big influence on Crosby, Stills, and Nash. The first time they sang together was in her kitchen and stuff like this. And she was a good friend of the band, and he was in the Hollies and hanging out with her at a Sunset Sound, I think, in LA. And she worshiped, you know, like John Lennon. And she's like, man, I love John Lennon. You know, because Graham knew them since they were 16. They used to tour together and all that stuff. Like he, you know, he's from Manchester, same deal, you know, British invasion. And she was like, what would John Lennon say if, you know, if he was here right now? Like, what would he say to me? You know? Yeah. And he was like, he'd probably say something pretty mean to you, you know, like he'd probably be an asshole to you, to be quite honest, you know, and keep walking, you know, and this is the mid 60s or whatever, you know, but it was just funny, you know, because, you know, she's like, she's like, he was a complicated guy, you know, as was McCartney, you know, like, but
having that much fame at that, you know, that young and like in a new country too, that would be intimidating at that age, you know, like that's a lot for anybody, even if you're talented, to absorb that much attention. You know?
Yeah, no, and they handled it well, you know, all things considered, you know, but they also didn't have, you know, it was very managed, you know, it was managed very well. And then of course their manager killed himself. So, you know, the dark times set in, but you know, whatever, it's bringing people pleasure. You know, the Beatles are not a bad influence by any stretch of the imagination. So it's probably the right time for that documentary to come out, because it's given people a little release and a little perspective, you know, and it's certainly a nutritious meal as far as art goes. But so that being said, I can't think of anything else to really talk about. I know I've been talking for a while. So listen, folks, I got a show coming up in Boston, Massachusetts, December 23rd at City Winery, man. It's a big show for me. I'm doing a 6 and a 9 p.m. show. Hope you guys can come out. It's a beautiful venue. It's their Haymarket Lounge, City Winery, Boston, December 23rd. We'll see you there. Otherwise, you can catch up with Jimmy. He's about to tell you where.
jbkonair.com. You can also follow my podcast, JBK On Air, anywhere that you get your podcasts. You'll search it and go ahead and subscribe, guys. A lot of interviews that from common people that you know, allow you to kind of see that even if you have a common job, you can make an impact in the world, you know.
Well, there you go. If you want to check in with the common people, you listen to Jimmy.
Yeah, the made man, Fat Jimmy.
Fat Jimmy's Corner. Fat Jimmy's. You know, there's a bar in New York. It's probably not there, but it was called Jimmy's Corner, and it was an old like boxing referee, and it was a boxers bar where boxers would hang out. And I went in there one time as Mike Tyson was walking out of there, Jimmy, and I just passed him, and just passing. And I love Mike Tyson, but like just passing him was like terrifying. You
He
know
was
what
in
I mean?
prison here for a while,
Oh, is that in Indiana?
Yeah,
Yeah.
he went to prison in Indiana. Reggie Miller had to visit him at the state prison. They had a bet that they would do between each other. Or I'm sorry, it was a bet between him and Spike Lee that if Reggie won, he would have to put Reggie's wife in his next movie. Or if Spike won, he would have to go visit Mike Tyson in the state prison.
That's crazy.
But
All right.
anyway.
Well, on that note, folks, thanks for listening. This is episode 39. Again, come out to Boston City Winery, December 23rd. If you're a New York City resident, I will be at the Iridium in New York City, January 26th. So we'll check in before then. We'll see you next week. Be safe, be healthy, be well. Peace.